My name is Susan Carty. I'm the Occupational Health Specialist here at Medgate UK, and I'll be the chair for today's session. I'm pleased to welcome Rob Hardman, the SEQOHS Chair, and Gemma Mackay from the SEQOHS Accreditation Manager, and they will be giving a presentation called SEQOHS and Assessor, an Introduction to SEQOHS. Next, we have Andrea Paterson, and her presentation is called SEQOHS and Assessor's Perspective. Our next speaker is Nessie Brooks, and Nessie and her team have been working towards accreditation for a few years now and will be sharing their experiences and pitfalls. And last but not least, David Maslen-Jones. David is the General Manager for Guy's and St Thomas's NHS Trust, and he'll be talking about the challenges of re-accreditation. The presentations will run for approximately 15 minutes each, and we'll open the floor up for questions at the end of today's session. But what I will ask is that you send these in to us electronically. So those of you who are looking at the slides that you've been sent via email, if you could email any questions into me, Susan Carty, I'll pick them up on my phone. Please indicate which of the speakers your question is for. Those of you who do have access to the video screen, if you look at the top of your screen, you've got a little box there. If you click on it, you'll have a drop down, and one of the icons will have chat underneath it. As you can see on this next slide, and if you can write your question in the box there as part of the chat box where the arrow is pointing now. We will be sending a follow-up email with a link to today's recording of the webinar as soon as it's ready, together with the presenter's slides, and we'll send the questions and answers to any of the unasked questions today. That takes care of all the housekeeping items I have here, so it's with great pleasure that I introduce Rob Hardman and Gemma Mackay, who will be presenting an introduction to SEQOHS.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. Just wanted to double check. So first of all, thank you very much, Sue, for giving us the opportunity to provide an update on SEQOHS for everyone this morning, and welcome everyone to the webinar. My name's Gemma Mackay. I'm the SEQOHS Accreditation Manager, and I'm based at the Royal College of Physicians. Unfortunately, my colleague, Dr. Rob Hardman, is unwell today, so I'll be presenting this on my own, but he will be available if you have any questions, if you send them through, and he'll be able to look at those as well. Next slide, please. So today I want to talk to you, firstly, to give an introduction about SEQOHS to those of you who don't perhaps know too much about it. So I'll be going into all of that for you, and also to give you an update about what SEQOHS is planning next in the future. So if we start with the purpose of SEQOHS, our purpose is to provide clear standards of practice and formal accreditation for all occupational health providers in the UK. And our main aim really is to improve the quality of occupational health delivery in the UK. Next slide. So those of you who are aware of SEQOHS and working towards accreditation will hopefully be quite familiar with that image on the left-hand side. So those are the SEQOHS standards, and they've been developed over a period of time. This is the latest version, which was released in 2015. And these are standards that services must demonstrate that they have met before they can become accredited. Now, services are accredited once they've shown that they've met the standards for 5 years, and that's subject to annual renewal assessments. And then services can re-accredit after 5 years. So accreditation is valid for 5 years, and then services can re-accredit after that for another 5 years. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide is quite interesting because it shows the number of services in the middle column that have overall registered with SEQOHS year by year. And on the right-hand side, it shows the numbers of services awarded accreditation in each year. So that's from the start of SEQOHS in 2010 up until last year, 2016. And 2017 is going to be a big year for SEQOHS. So we've got a lot of assessments booked already this year, lots of services registering to start working towards accreditation. And as of today, there are 209 services currently SEQOHS accredited. Next slide. Working towards accreditation is something that services put a lot of hard work into. They're striving to achieve accreditation and to demonstrate quality. And this can be, it's a process that sometimes takes time, but is a lot of, do find this very rewarding. I'm going to let you take a minute just to read some of the feedback we've had from services on the screen. Next slide, please. And here's more feedback from services. So,
yeah, Craig and Tinny.
So you can see services do, on the whole, find accreditation a beneficial process, and this can have a wide-ranging impact across the service. So particularly the assessors are able to highlight areas of strengths that the services have, areas for improvement, and help services to continue to work towards quality and take pride in the work that they do. Next slide. So how does accreditation work? So you've seen feedback from the services. I'm going to talk a little bit in just about the accreditation cycle so that you can see practically what this means for services. Next slide. So when people think of accreditation, they usually think of it as a process that starts when they register and then finishes the moment that they're awarded their certificate. Actually, I think that this couldn't be further from the truth. So of course it is fantastic for services, so they're working towards accreditation, they get their certificate, and that's something that they should be proud of. What I do think services need to think about is that this is a cycle, so it doesn't stop once your service is accredited. It's a continual process improvement journey. So you'll see on the screen that this is a cycle that very much continues forward. So services should be assessed, they'll strengthen their service, they'll identify improvements, recognise those strengths, and provide assurance, and so on. And that we would expect that to continue for the 5 years and for the next 5 years and onwards. Next slide. So this is a quick diagram really to show how accreditation can help drive quality. So you'll see on the left is performance and how this improves over time. So we have services self-assess. So they look at the SEQOHS standards, will have access to our website, and will go through the self-assessment tool to check, are they meeting the standards, and they'll tick it off as yes. And if not, then they'll have access to an action plan that will help them identify any areas where they don't meet the standards and what they can do to help them get there. Then the peer review stage, that's the assessment itself. So SEQOHS assessors will assess a service once you've done the self-assessment, and then once a service has demonstrated that they can meet the standards, they're awarded accreditation. Next slide. So what we're trying to do in SEQOHS is make sure, as I said, that services continue to meet the standards and continue to improve their service once they get to accreditation. So one thing that's not quite shown up on this diagram is it might, if you press it again to it might come up. Yeah, perfect, thank you. So this is the red line on the right-hand side shows what we found was happening once services had reached accreditation, would be that it could be quite difficult for services to maintain that level in their service once they got to the re-accreditation stage at 5 years. So what we're trying to do in SEQOHS is reduce the burden for services during the run-up to their re-accreditation assessments after they've been accredited for 5 years, and we want services to be able to maintain the standards so that it's more like the blue line at the top rather than the red line that dips. So how we're doing that is we're making or planning to make a lot of changes to our annual renewal process, and this would mean that it would be reducing the burden for services at the 5-year point so that we can check in more easily with services how they're doing at the annual renewal stage. Next slide, please. So that's a bit on the process. I wanted to talk to you about what support is available for services. We have our knowledge management system, which is available to all services that have registered with SEQOHS on our web tool. There is a big project underway at the moment to add more resources for services to make it very clear for you to identify what it is that you need to do to help your service meet the standards and make that really clear to you. These resources will be added to the website in the summer. We also have our training days. So in 2017, we're changing how we're doing training slightly. So we will have Stage A training, which will be available for services who perhaps don't know much about SEQOHS or would like to start working towards quality improvements and maybe look at getting back to basics. So what is a policy, how do you put one together, things like that. And then Stage B training, or how to prepare for accreditation training days. Services actually get one free place at one of these training days every 4 years. And this is to help ensure services are prepared for their assessment. So if you would like to book onto one of these training days, you'll have access to this on our website, so you can book straight on. We also have our evidence guidance, which is available to all services that have registered for SEQOHS, and that's occupational health services, occupational health physiotherapy services, and single-handed providers. So each of those types of services have their own evidence guidance. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have an action planning tool which services can access as they're working towards accreditation. Next slide, please. So to summarise really, we believe we're making a difference in SEQOHS through the accreditation scheme. We believe we're doing this by improving the quality of occupational health services and improving quality of care for workers. This is really important to us, and we want this to be clear to everyone who's working towards accreditation. Next slide. So we've said questions will be captured. And as I mentioned, Rob and myself will be able to go through these questions. So if you do have any, please add them in. Next slide. And if you'd like more information about SEQOHS, then please visit our website. So that's seqohs.org, or if you email askseqohs@rcplondon.ac.uk. Many thanks. So Sue, that's the end of my section. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma, for that really informative update. And it's great to hear that in 2017 it's going to be a very busy year for people becoming accredited. Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Andrea Patterson. And Andrea will be giving a presentation on SEQOHS, an assessor's perspective. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, Sue, and good morning, everybody. My name's Andrea Patterson, and I'm the Professional Head of Occupational Health at Nuffield Health. And I put our own service through the accreditation process in 2013, and we'll therefore be coming up for our 5-year renewal next year. And I've been a SEQOHS Assessor since 2012. In my time as a SEQOHS Assessor, I've had the opportunity to assess a variety of types of organisations, including NHS, private providers, single-handed providers, higher education. So I have a flavour of working as an assessor across a variety of industries. The next slide, please, Sue. So in this session, I wanted to look at give you some tips on what the assessors are looking for with the evidence, and to give you some pointers and some tips on evidence upload. To highlight some of the common pitfalls, which are the standards which services are most frequently deferred on, and just to highlight which ones those are, and to give you a bit of an overview of what happens on the day when there's a site visit. Next slide, please, Sue. So the process begins when you start with your evidence upload. I won't go into the pre-bit because Gemma's already covered that in terms of preparing you for that. But I suppose my watch out here is don't underestimate how much time you need to go through this whole process. Most services, I find, take up to about a year to really get all their evidence in line the first time. If you could click once, please. So during that 12-month period, you will be uploading your information onto the secure portal. Just wanted to reassure you that the information you upload is treated as confidential. At the time that you select what type of services you're offering, it will influence the tool, the portal, and any standards that don't apply to you will be greyed out. So all the standards which apply will be quite clear, and you do need to upload evidence against every standard that applies to you. Do make sure that your evidence is complete and in date. It's quite easy if you've spent several months uploading information for the stuff that you've uploaded at the beginning to have actually become out of date and perhaps you to miss that. So do go over your evidence before you finally press that submit button to check that things are in date and it is complete. As well as the opportunity to upload the evidence, there's the comment section and a comment box. And please do use that. You can clarify any points about your service that might help us to understand the type of evidence you're uploading or how you're working. You can also use it in that early stage to ask us questions if there are things that you need some support or clarification about. Can you click again, please, Sue? So once then you have pressed that submit button, the office will liaise with you and offer you a date for your site visit. This applies to all services except single-handed practitioners who don't actually have a site visit, but there will be a date set for when there is a meeting, usually a telephone meeting with the assessors. So the date is set 4 months after you have submitted your evidence. This isn't because there's a backlog. It isn't because, we just want it to take ages. It's actually because there's a significant amount of work that happens between week 1 and that actual site visit. So once we have, we will actually, the lead assessor will be appointed. There's always 2 assessors per assessment. The assessment team could be an occupational health advisor, it could be an occupational health physician, it could be an occupational health business manager. There are always 2 assessors, and one of those assessors is always a clinician. The lead assessor will ring the service and introduce themselves and talk to them about the service, answer any initial questions, and just sort of begin to build that relationship, so taking a little bit of the fear and the scariness out of it, hopefully. The first evidence review then takes place. And this is when the assessors review all the information that you have uploaded over those previous months. We usually allow roughly 3 weeks for this type of process to take place, because there's a lot of information to read. And during this time, we will be asking you lots of questions, asking for further evidence. So please don't be surprised when we make that when we actually give you that feedback, that we're often asking for a lot of information. It's quite normal to be asking for lots of additional information and clarification during that first evidence review. The service then has about 3 weeks to respond to that, those first requests for comments and further information. And then the assessors will, at the end of that period, do the second evidence review. Usually there's less requirement for documents and comments, but there is still some at that second evidence review process. So we will, during that part of the process, still be asking for clarification. We may ask you for further evidence. So that's all going on. So there's quite a dialogue going on during the first and the second evidence review. So I suppose the watch out services is that, you actually do need to have someone who's able to respond and who's able to work. So, you do need to make sure you've allocated resources to be working through this through the whole evidence review process. We will then have a period when you can respond to that, which again is usually about 2 weeks, and then there may be a little bit of final comments going backwards and forwards, and then the site is usually locked 1 to 2 weeks before the visit, and during that time the assessors will be ensuring they understand exactly what evidence they need to see on the day, and we'll clarify with you during those final comment periods the evidence that we want to see during the day. If you could click again, Sue. We then will have the on-site visit. I've actually got a slide later on which will talk through this a little bit more. So, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail just later on. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So, while we're talking about evidence, I thought it'd be helpful to give you some pointers of what we do want to see and also what we don't want to see. So, please do upload your policies, procedures, information leaflets. But the watch out here is that please make sure they are version controlled and in date. We do expect to see that you have systems and processes for monitoring that. So version control and dates are really important. We want to see, the whole point of this of the SEQOHS assessment is to see that your policies and procedures and systems are being applied in practice. So we don't want to see blank templates. We don't want to see blank forms. We want to see evidence that you are actually doing this work. So please upload completed audits and action plans, signed confidentiality agreements, everything that's completed. And I've given you some examples in the bullet points on that slide there. You can use minutes of meetings and emails to show monitoring of the service. So don't, for example, upload a complaint management procedure, but tell us how you've managed a complaint in practice. That's the sort of thing that we want to see. We want as much evidence as possible uploaded on the day, and don't save it for the site visit because there's limited time on the site visit. We understand, particularly for large organisations or large NHS trusts, that there are sometimes documents that you will be uploading which are large and generic company-wide documents and perhaps not specific to the Occupational Health Department. And if they're relevant to that standard, that's absolutely fine. But what we would ask is that if you've got a really large, all-encompassing document, is that you actually direct assessors to the relevant page or section that it is that you are wanting us to reference for that particular standard. So you could hyperlink it, you could highlight it, but please do make a reference to the page and the section in the comment box so that we can easily find it. There's loads and loads of evidence that the assessors have to go through, and we do want to make sure that we can see that. Can you just go back a slide again, please, Sue? Yeah. The last point on there is about national guidance. That's it. So the last slide is about national guidance point there. We don't want you to upload national guidance. We know what the national guidance is. We want to see your local policies and procedures. If the evidence applies to more than one standard, next slide please, that's it. If evidence applies to more than one standard, upload it to each standard where it applies. It's very difficult if we have to keep coming out and trying to find where you uploaded it the first time. And there are some key bits of information that you might upload 3 or 4 times into different standards. That's absolutely fine, but do upload it everywhere where it applies. And use the comments box as I mentioned earlier. One of the areas that often has a bit of dialogue around is around training requirements. I know that more and more people are recording all of this information online in systems in their department. But we do actually ask if you could upload a matrix with your team and their training requirements and when this has been completed and how you track it, so we can see this. We can see this evidence at a glance, because on the day we don't have time, particularly with large services, to look at every single person's training records to see that they're in date on some sort of integrated HR system. So please do take the time to prepare that type of information. You will be asked for it. Single-handed practitioners will still need to have evidence of policies and procedures, evidence of audit, evidence that they've checked and monitored the work of any third-party providers who may cover for them. So just a sort of a little pointer for single-handed practitioners. Next slide, please. So, sticking points. So these are the standards where we see the most deferrals, perhaps, that are occurring. So in Standard A, A1.3, this standard is about monitoring the clinical work that's outsourced to any third-party providers. So if you are outsourcing work to another SEQOHS accredited provider, that makes it much easier, because we will know that that SEQOHS provider is monitoring the qualifications, etc., of that individual. So we may not necessarily need to see that you've checked those qualifications, because that can be assumed if they are SEQOHS accredited. But we would still want to see that you've got a service level agreement. We would still want to see that you are monitoring the standard of work that company or those workers are providing to you. If they are not SEQOHS accredited, then we do need to see evidence that you have made reasonable steps to check that those people are qualified and suitable to do the work that you're outsourcing to them. So I think that sometimes is an issue for people in A. In Standard B, there are two, and I've highlighted in red the one about the paper records, because there's quite a few parts to this standard. It's transported, accessed, stored and disposed of safely and securely. And I think what we frequently see is that people give evidence about one or two of those 4 items or 5 items, but they don't give evidence across all of it. We want to see evidence for each part. So it's about looking at the standard and making sure that you upload evidence that shows the process all the way through and that you don't miss out a section of it. In B2.4, intellectual property of purchasers is protected, and sometimes people miss that. So we're looking to see for commercial providers that there are statements about intellectual property in contracts that you have with your clients. We're also looking for everybody to see that there is something in your confidentiality policy. It may be that you've included a line in your confidentiality agreements, but we do need to see something about intellectual property, that this is something that is understood by your teams. In Standard C, this standard is the 2 I picked out, C2.4 and C2.5, are really about clinical governance and audit. So in C, we're looking to see that you've got standing operating procedures and policies and procedures covering the whole range of work that you're doing, which is evidence-based and up-to-date, and that you are monitoring the work that you are doing in that standard. C2.5 builds on C2.4 because it's looking for systematic audit. We often see audit, or we always see audit of clinical record management, but we sometimes don't see audit across the whole range of clinical services that you're delivering. So if you're doing an immunisation service, if you're doing health surveillance, if you're doing pre-placement screening, we expect to see that you are monitoring and auditing across the whole range of clinical practice and not just the case management aspect of your service. The other watch out is that often people are auditing, but they don't close that audit cycle. So we are looking to see that you have, where services need improvement, that you have an action plan and that you are acting on that action plan. If there isn't a need for an action plan, that you've documented that down so that we can actually see that some action has been taken and that you have really understood the results of your audit. So the ones around C is around the clinical governance and the audit process. And then finally, sticking points in Standard E. This is more the standard which relates to how you're working with your contractors. In E, ensuring we've purchased at the outset the resources required and the scope of any business continuity planning to protect service delivery. So we expect to see that within your contracts, and often business continuity planning is missing. So that's just a watch out to make sure that you don't forget that aspect within your contracts. And in E1.4, advise purchasers of the value of occupational health needs assessments and timely management of ill health. We absolutely understand that you cannot make a company take your advice, but we do need to see evidence that you are giving that appropriate advice, either where you're seeing something which is perhaps good or reportable, which is showing maybe a review of control measures is needed from your health surveillance, or that you are, recommending or offering your services and able to do sort of needs assessments for those clients. So we do need to see evidence around that aspect. Thank you, Sue. Next slide. Oh, that's gone very small for those who are looking at it on the slide. But this is just a high-level overview of the site visit. So on the actual day of assessment, the assessors will arrive between sort of 9 and 9:30 in the morning, and we will want to meet the team and as many of the team as we can and when we first arrive. We ask the company to provide a brief overview of their services, and it does need to be brief, so no more than 10 to 15 minutes, giving us an overview about your service. We will then want to have a walk around and to have a look at your department and see. And there will be also a requirement here to do most of Standard D, we do actually on the day. For those of you who are really familiar with the Standard D is around things like your disability access and arrangements, your hand hygiene arrangements. We will be looking at your equipment. We will want to look at your vaccination fridge, your anaphylaxis arrangements, all that sort of thing. So it's quite a walk around and a little sort of dive into the actual department itself. Then the assessors will want to probably meet on their own to start to make sure that they have got all the evidence that they need, and they will be asking you to supply evidence to us of the things that have not been seen. So we will meet. We will ask you then to come back in and to support us and to supply evidence that we haven't been able to see. Typically, people don't like uploading things like appraisal documents onto the web tool. So those are things that we would often look at. Obviously, anything that's online that isn't easy for you to upload, we would also look at that time. We have a working lunch because by this time we're thinking of our report and trying to get our report written, and it's quite a lot of pressure on the assessors to get this all done within the time. So we need to keep ourselves quite focused. So we have a working lunch, and then the period over lunch and after lunch we spend compiling our report. We still may need suddenly to ask you to give us an extra bit of evidence if we suddenly realise we haven't seen something. So it really helps if there is somebody available. Then report writing. Once we've written the report, we will have a meeting with you, and we will ask you all to come in. Often senior directors, we like them to come as well if they're able to. And we will give you high-level verbal feedback on the assessment. So this will be preliminary feedback. It isn't a final. It isn't your final report because it has to go through a quality assurance process. So we will go through each standard and we will tell you anything where we have a recommendation. If we are suggesting a recommendation, this is something that you will need to have rectified by the time of your first annual review. The other option is that we have a key action. If we have a key action, that will prevent you from being accredited immediately. You will need to rectify that key action, and usually there's a period of about 3 months for them to rectify any key action. We also will give you congratulations because we quite often see excellent work when we go round, and we often see where you've gone over and above and beyond to, in terms of how you're managing something. So we will also recognise any particularly good work that we do. So we go through that process for each of the 5 standards. then we will be telling you whether our recommendation is you will know if there are any deferrals, and you will know if there are any key actions. We will not leave a copy of the report with you on the day. We are not allowed to do that because it has to be QA'd and finalised. So the report will then go to the QA team, who do challenge the assessors. We have to justify our decisions. They can overturn our decisions if they feel we have been too harsh, or they could increase something from a recommendation to the deferral if they feel we've been too soft. And this is so that we can actually try and ensure that there is some consistency within the way that the services are being assessed. The QA process normally takes about 4 weeks, or up to 4 weeks, and then you will be given your final visit, your final report. If there is a deferral, and you can, as soon as you've been able to rectify that, if you communicate with your lead assessor via the web tool, we will review that evidence, and as soon as you have signed off that you have done everything, we will assess that and then send that through to QA. So as I say, typically it's 3 months. It may not take 3 months. It may be something quite quick that you can do. If something is quite complex, then occasionally it can be extended to 6 months for a deferral. So I think that really is a sort of a whistle-stop tour of the assessment process. Next slide, Sue. I think that's it from me, actually. Yeah. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrea. Some very useful tips, and most interesting, I think, for everyone to hear the sticking points and an overview of what to expect at the site visit. Very interesting. And if you've got any questions for Andrea or Gemma, please either email them through to me or send them through on the chat facility on your screen, and we'll be taking questions at the end. Next, I'd like to introduce Nessie Brooks. Nessie is the Head of Profession for Kent County Council Staff Care Services. And Nessie and her team are working towards accreditation, and she'll share some of their experiences and pitfalls.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
That's great. Okay, thank you. Because I'm not able to see what you're seeing, so this should be interesting. So just to remind you, my name is Nessie Brooks. I'm Head of Profession here at Staff Care Services, which is an income-generating occupational health service, which more and more services, of course, are income-generating now as well. So a bit of my background, I've been in occupational health since the early 90s, and I've worked right across all of the sectors. So next slide, please, which is a transition slide. So I've started my first bullet point with saying that my life is a hard one, which is with a smile at the end. And it is really very much a personal viewpoint and a personal experience. So right for many years, despite arguing that there should be standards across the occupational health profession, I beat myself up and I just think, why is it so hard for me to complete the SEQOHS standards, especially as I'm so signed up to it? Next bullet point, I've attended all of the study days, all of the workshops. I've made the journey from the concept of occupational health standards. I've agreed with it. I've been there and I've had the discussions while it's been created and how it should be formed and the proposed changes since it started. I've helped evaluate the standards, yet for me, I still haven't found, and I hate this word, the time to gather the evidence, put it together, and to submit, press the submit button. Next click, please. I've even spoken to people who gathered the evidence and have acquired the SEQOHS standards. But do you know what? Perhaps I'm speaking to the wrong person, because it never sounds easy. And I'd just like to thank Andrea for her part in giving us some tips as to the bits that have been missed, because now I know as I go forward which bits to do. Next click. I myself have completed the ISO 9001 standard, which is a similar sort of exercise, and I have managed to complete it successfully over the last 4 to 5 years. So again, I ask myself, why is it that I can do the ISO 9001 and not do SEQOHS, which is my profession? And I think, on reflection, it is because it's a voluntary accreditation. My employer understands what ISO 9001 is. My employer does not understand the benefits of SEQOHS, despite speaking about it. So when it comes to finding time and asking for the resources to support me, they're prepared to do it for the ISO 9001, and it's a bit of a hard, the fight is a bit harder when it comes to SEQOHS. And then, of course, if you do the next click, my biggest fear is this audit by peers, because for me, I want to be the best. When I have that visit from the peer reviewers, I do not want any key actions. For me, I want to get it right first time, because I don't want to be going back to it. So the next slide, please. So what are my obstacles? Resources. No matter how the plan, there's always the unexpected absence. And it's not just someone going sick, it's also annual leave that comes up at last minute, and being female, the pregnancy. The other obstacle for me is that, as I said at the beginning of my speak, it was about income generation. And I think one of the worst barriers, or one of the worst things that gets in the way, is the fact that I'm a manager with an occupational health professional background. And therefore, when I have the unexpected absences, I am the one that usually steps in. Bottom line is, for me, income generation and meeting the SLAs and the KPIs for all of my clients. And therefore, finding time to do the SEQOHS gets put to the bottom again. I'm also called upon to manage complex contacts. Whilst my team are excellent and they manage most of the day-to-day stuff, there are still the calls from managers in the service, from clients, from customers, who actually, they only want to speak to the manager, and get caught up in having to manage those types of contacts, which can, again, take a lot of time. I have tried allocating a project lead, and that hasn't worked out with the time, because that member of staff has become unwell and or they've left. So, as we say, something else always seems to get in the way, and I really do believe it's about the fact that SEQOHS is not mandatory and is not compulsory. So that's just my overview, my personal history of why I find it hard to work towards SEQOHS, but I am still working towards SEQOHS. I am signed up and I do believe it is a good thing, but sometimes it's about finding the time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nessie, for sharing there some of the obstacles and challenges that I know many of the participants will be able to identify with, especially if they've also been working towards SEQOHS. But as we've heard in the earlier slides, especially Jemma, of the benefits of SEQOHS accreditation and also looking towards the increasing evidence towards quality for your own service. Next, I'd like to introduce, last but not least, I should say, David Maslen-Jones. And David is going to share his view of the challenges of reaccreditation. Thank you, David.
So, hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hi. Okay. I'm getting a feeling from, particularly from what Nessie just said about, there's a lot of fear out there about the initial accreditation. And I've, as well as having put 3 services through this process, I'm also a lead assessor like Andrea, and I'd say don't be afraid of it. Usually as an assessor you go in and you see a lot of really good work that's already happening, and it's not, if you record what you do and you record it well, then you're halfway to getting through an assessment. So for those of you who are planning on the initial accreditation, the message is don't be afraid. It's not insurmountable and you can do it. But now to move on to reaccreditation. And I suppose the first thing to say is that my first OH service that I was accredited in, I was actually deferred on 10 points and had to submit further evidence. So I've been there and I've got that experience. But now I work at Guy's and St Thomas's. So next slide, please, Sue. So who are we? Well, everybody will have heard about of Guy's. We're the largest NHS OH service in the country. We have 64 members of staff, and that does not include physiotherapy because that's supplied to our trust separately. And we've got a very much established OH research team. Many of you will have heard of Ira Madan, who leads our research team. He's done lots of research across the OH community over the last few years. So next slide, please, Sue.
The last few days. She was talking about it.
Okay, so we first started in 1982. We've got a very large commercial portfolio, and we deliver occupational health across a range of sectors from industry, hotels, local government, the Houses of Parliament, and we have a number of very high-profile people within our team. And which is recognised nationally. And we have a lot of students from other countries, medical students who come here for OH training. We were the first NHS OH service to be accredited. And interestingly, I was actually one of the assessors who accredited this service originally. So taking us through it again at the moment is very interesting. And actually looking at what Gemma said in her first slide about the dip, the red line that dips below that services are accredited, they tend to let things slide and go down to the bottom. That has certainly happened here and had happened in both the other services where I was involved. So, slide. So it should be easy. I've talked about this being a really an exemplar service. We've got all these things happening all the time, lots of audit. Appraisals are all done. As most NHS trusts, it's all an electronic process. And we have all of these things going on within our department. So why has it not been easy here? Slide. So I suppose the key messages are that really we did a lot of work running up to that first assessment. And when I came here 5 years ago, I was very impressed by some really good induction documentation and some really good policies. And having arrived at here a year ago when they'd been without a general manager for nearly a year, the first thing that I found was a lot of the policies had just been allowed to go out of date. We weren't recording a lot of the good things that we were doing. And so I suppose the first message is actually about don't underestimate the time actually required for reaccreditation, because it's taken me a good part of the last 6 months to actually go through all of this, even with a team who have been appointed to support us going through the process. I think it's been really useful for me here that there's been someone in the service who has done it before and is really good at policies and procedures. And if you've got someone in your team who's really good at that, at policies and procedures, then bring them in at an early stage. Focusing on what Andrea said about uploading evidence at the start and then finding it was out of date 6 months later, the same applies in reaccreditation. You need to make sure that every piece of evidence is up to date. And something which was initially on the first assessment and which Andrea has again talked about in her evidence that the assessors are looking for is this focus on service level agreements. And it will really help if you check that any SLA, whether you're going for initial accreditation or reaccreditation, includes the requirements for intellectual property and RIDDLE. And I was really surprised that actually my service didn't have that in their service level agreements. And by way of evidence, what we've managed to do here is to do a template letter which went out to all of our customers, which actually said we're adjusting our terms of reference and you must now take notice of the following paragraphs. And we added 2 extra paragraphs about intellectual property and the requirement to report RIDDLE. So that's a quick win for you, either at accreditation or reaccreditation, to get that in there. The standards changed to the latest version, as Gemma said, 2 years ago, and they removed Domain G, which was principally for NHS services. But they're still in there. Those requirements for the NHS standards haven't gone away. They're included in other standards. So there was something about a costing model, and that now goes into Domain A2. And the requirement to offer the SIC or NHS services is now included in the section on, and I haven't got it in front of me, the section on relationship with customers. So they're all still in there somewhere. So make sure when you look at the standards that you're aware of where those NHS standards are if you're an NHS service. And a really good key for everybody, whether you're going down the accreditation or the reaccreditation pathway, is to get those staff surveys and the management surveys underway now. Because if you're anything like we are, you'll find it really hard to get managers to engage and provide feedback. And we've just done a process now where every single management referral in the last 3 months, and there are literally hundreds of them, included a requirement for a request for people, managers to respond to us, and we had 16 responses in 3 months. So I'd really encourage you to get those surveys underway now. Slide, please, Sue. So the common pitfalls, and I can use this as not just from my service, but from a couple of services I've been to recently, which demonstrate that actually what Gemma had said earlier about the way that services fall off after achieving reaccreditation is a really good measure. There was one service I went to who stopped using Mohawk as a benchmarking tool, and that was their prime method of actually, or their prime driver for doing audit. So for some reason there was just no recent audit that had been done, and no one had picked that up. So you should have a good governance structure, whether you're NHS or external, which has a regular meeting to actually look at audit and a good audit program. And if you're doing something well at the moment, keep doing it after you've been accredited, because it then becomes business as usual. Something I've experienced here as well as elsewhere is that policies haven't been updated. Some of them were predating 5 years ago and had not been properly looked at since that time. And there have been huge changes in employment and legislation in the last few years. And obviously, if a policy isn't updated, it's not taking account of that. I think what I found here and elsewhere is that the priority, and it refers to what Nessie was saying, is that income generation can take over your requirements. So you stop doing the business as usual, and actually you focus on your customers and actually on getting that new piece of work in. But if you keep doing the good things that you did in the first place to get accreditation and keep them going as business as usual, you'll be in a far better position when you come up to this point where you're ready to go for reaccreditation. Again, my next point was echoed by Nessie in that senior managers, not just within the NHS but externally, do not appreciate the importance of accreditation. If you do external work, increasingly contracts require that you're SEQOHS accredited. And that's a huge driver if you're doing external income generation to actually get that accreditation. But what I've experienced is elsewhere that senior managers don't appreciate what it's all about, and therefore they don't give the backing to the OH team to go and do it. And that actually is compounded, particularly in the NHS, with an organisational focus changing to cost improvement programs and huge cuts being made in budgets, which mean that you don't have the sufficient resource to actually commit to that reaccreditation. So there's something about actually when SEQOHS come around, as assessors, we'll be looking to see that you're properly resourced and making comments about that. And something we'll look at is your KPIs and whether you're meeting KPIs, because that's an indication of how well you are resourced. So I suppose there were two remembers really. The first thing is on initial accreditation, you choose the date when you're ready, ready for that accreditation, and you liaise with the office. For reaccreditation, you tell them you're ready, but that you'll be given a date when the inspection will take place. And that's not to say you won't be allowed to negotiate that to a certain degree, but you'll be aware that actually you need to get that reaccreditation to continue with the SEQOHS badge on your service. Slide, please. So I've referred to business as usual, and the illustration here on the right, we do activity reports for all our customers, and it's easy if you've got Medgate to actually pull all this information on your service performance from your Cohort database. And I'm not allowed to be biased, so I would say that Warwick also offer similar data extraction methods. But it's really useful to actually set up a process which is really quick to do on your IT system, which will provide you with quarterly utilisation reports. And that also not just provides evidence for SEQOHS, but it's really good for your customers. Establish an audit program, so plan your audits throughout the year and delegate to each of your team responsibility for one or another audit. Because actually it shares the load, and you're actually giving them something to get their teeth into, which actually contributes to the whole process. Perhaps actually I've put here annual report, but that builds on the quarterly utilisation reports above. So if you've got the reports, all the stuff on the system, then it's easy to produce these reports, which will provide the evidence. When I came here, the first thing I did at Guy's and Tommy's was actually to start regular action meetings, getting together all of our nurses in one room, looking at the standards and what was required, and delegating to everyone within the team responsibility for various domains. And it's really helpful. If you are seeing a wall in front of you as a manager which looks impossible to climb, then get that work delegated to the rest of your team. Give them all a bit of responsibility for that. And actually do regular reviews of your performance with your customers, because again, that is good evidence going forward of how you're delivering your services, which contribute to the customer feedback. But going back to the initial message I gave, is document everything you're doing. Make sure that if you have a telephone conversation with someone about a review of your service, you document it in an email just to make sure that actually the key points of your meeting or your conversation are documented, and get it written down somewhere. And if someone declines to have a meeting with you to discuss your performance as a customer, then document that they've declined that meeting, or document and keep that email for evidence, because it will help you in the longer term. So my advice, and I've already said it, haven't I? Document all that you do and the processes that you use. And make sure that SEQOHS is embedded into everything that you do. So if you have team meetings, put SEQOHS on the agenda. If you have governance meetings, put your SEQOHS accreditation on the agenda, and make sure it's embedded into everything you do, and record everything. Share the workload. You can't do it all on your own. And develop an action plan. And if you go on the website, you can actually download an Excel spreadsheet of your evidence, and you can actually export that to Excel, and the SEQOHS office can actually provide you with the advice as to how you can do that. And then you can adjust that Excel template to fit your own needs. Develop that action plan and get everyone involved. And those, I suppose, are my key messages. And that's it from me.
Thank you very much, David, for sharing your key messages. And to me, one of the things that will stay in my mind especially is the fact that if you're coming up for reaccreditation, you need to make that planning in advance and yourself, because you are allocated a date and you don't choose it. Now, I'm just going to have a look to see if anyone has sent any questions. I haven't had actually any questions sent through. Does anyone have any questions? In which case, then, this is the end of today's session, and I'd like to thank our presenters, Gemma, Andrea, Nessie, and David, and of course you, the audience, for joining us today. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, we will send a follow-up email with a link to a recording of today's webinar as soon as it's ready, together with the presenter slides. I will also include details for the SEQOHS website and also any contact details so that you're able to ask questions of them personally. Many thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.